Americans for Prosperity is committed to breaking barriers across the country, and Americans for Prosperity is growing across North Dakota. By calling on lawmakers to reduce taxes, spend less, improve health care, and provide second chances, we can empower all North Dakotans to rise. We're fighting for you. Join us today so we can make North Dakota the best state to live, work, and raise a family. Americans for Prosperity paid for this ad. My guest is Senator Kevin Cramer, who joins me. We were talking a little bit before we started, Kevin, about your personal quarantine efforts, where you're stuck at home like pretty much all the rest of us, except you're still getting into your federal office in Bismarck there now and then through like a secret backdoor entrance or something.
Well, it's not quite secret, but it is an employee entrance into the federal building, and I have a good close parking spot, so I walk in and it's 3 flights, really 4 flights upstairs, and I come into this is probably more information people care about, but I do have a pretty nice office suite in the corner of the third floor of the federal building, down the hall from Senator Hoban, who's on the other corner. But I do have a separate entrance out of the hallway into my own little office and conference room. So I literally am not even, at least through a doorway, connected to the reception area in my office. So I do lock myself in here, but I've set up a pretty convenient little Skype studio where I do a lot of video conferences and television interviews, things like that every day. And then, of course, do the radio thing every other day or so. It seems I'm on somebody's station and this. And I like it. I like being able to get out of the house, drive down, Washington Street and pull into the federal building if for no other reason, just to get out. But I also remain, pretty quarantined in here. So it works. We all have our ways of working in this weird world we're in now.
Well, for sure. I wish we had something else to talk about. I'd like to be watching baseball and talking about campaigns, but we're that's not the world we're in right now. So let's talk about oil. That's been a big one. I know the big news yesterday was that we had the potential for a deal. Mexico, I guess, was still a potential holdout. But by a deal, I'm talking about OPEC, the international oil. Can we call them a cartel? I mean, that's what they are, international oil cartel.
I think so. I mean, that's what they are, yeah.
That basically that seeks to manipulate the oil markets to their benefit. But it sounded like Saudi Arabia and Russia were on board. They're going to do some production cuts. Mexico's the handout. Any updates on that deal?
So it's interesting, and I could give a lot of history about it, but we'll spare you that for now. But my understanding of the meeting, and of course I've watched it very carefully, I think played a fairly significant role in actually getting them to do it. And we were hoping actually for a larger announcement of larger cuts than the 10 million that they're talking about, because not all of the 10 million is even OPEC. I mean, they're counting on the United States making some of those cuts. So as you said, it was an early holdout, at least a late holdout. I think they've since come along with it after President Trump called President Obrador this morning. So it's really largely a Saudi-Russia agreement, and it should be, because they're the ones that increased supply dramatically after a decrease in demand as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the demand went down about the same as their supply went up. And that all started because Saudi Arabia and Russia had a meeting to discuss cutting supply in their production in the wake of the COVID. Russia said, no, we're not going to. And so Saudi and Russia decided to, instead of decrease, to increase production and try to drive each other out of business. I think it's more devious than that. I think they have the American shale industry in their sights, and they see this as an opportunity to eliminate their greatest competition, which didn't even exist 15 years ago. And they've tried this one other time, and we outlasted them. And they're trying it again now in light of this pandemic and the demand downturn. So yesterday's meeting was the result of some strong diplomacy and some carrying a big stick. It sounds like they're back on track for maybe 10 million total barrels cut, which is not insignificant, by the way. It'd be the largest cut that OPEC's ever announced. It's just that it's coming on the heels of like I said, a supply glut that has turned into craziness where everything is capped off. But in addition to all of that, there is the next step, and that is a meeting with the G20 countries, which Saudi Arabia just happens to have the chairman's seat in right now. And they're hoping to maybe get another 5 million barrels of cuts out of the rest of the G20. So we'll see. But at the end of the day, we need to get the economy going again so that we can increase the demand, which is what really should be driving.
I mean, that's what I was looking at some numbers in a report, and they were. I mean, these are obviously very broad numbers, and they go up and down. But I mean, generally, we use about 100 million barrels of oil in the world a day. That's sort of all the different ways we use oil. It's about 100 million barrels, and that has. I mean, analysts are for that's gone down like 20 or 30 million. So basically, I mean, since we're talking about these round numbers, that's essentially a 20 to 30% reduction in demand. Right? We're just not using it. And a lot of that's just because we're not driving to work. We're not going on vacation. We're not flying. We're not doing a lot of the things that consumes that oil, and so demand drops out, and then simultaneously Saudi Arabia and Russia increase. It's a double whammy where you're getting hit on the supply side and the demand side. If the OPEC deal comes through that addresses some of the supply side issues, one thing that was interesting was this talk about, and it seemed the report I was reading, it seemed like Saudi Arabia, which is kind of the key to a lot of this. It seemed like they were satisfied with America's production going down just as a natural function of the market. They were okay with that. But I mean, because a president order, because we have a very different, I mean, Saudi Arabia's oil industry is state owned. Russia's oil industry is state owned. They can, I mean, they have bureaucrats who literally, and maybe not literally, but figuratively are controlling a spigot of the oil that their country produces. Can the president just tell Continental Resources, stop producing, you can only produce this much oil?
Well, we have antitrust laws and collusion laws that don't allow that, of course, unless there's an emergency of some sort. So I doubt that they could, and they shouldn't have to in the first place. But just to be clear about Saudi Arabia, we all know about the Crown Prince, MBS, as he's known. His half brother is the energy minister. Just to let you know, just how closely, how directly leadership in Saudi Arabia is to the oil industry. So you're not far off when you say literally. And so anyway, you're right. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the biggest problem because they're the biggest producer, and they increased their production by 2.3 million barrels per day. So given your 100 million, consumption number, that one country alone, added that 2.3% to production in one day, and then you add Russia's, and I mean they basically increase supply and production by the same amount as was lost in that demand. So no, I don't think, back to your original point, I don't think the president can really order companies to it. Now, we've already seen a reduction of about 500,000 barrels per day in production because of the natural outcome of a market. That's likely to get to 1 million and maybe 1.5 million, which 1.5 million is the number that they're adding to their own numbers in terms of cuts. And that does, we hope that that's going to be satisfactory. While our government doesn't produce oil, we do have a fair number of mineral acres that are owned by the federal government because they're on federal lands or under federal lands and offshore. So it's not like we're not in the business a little bit either. But they also, the Energy Information Administration, which is a division of the Department of Energy, which does, by the way, a great job of providing information and data. They're very good. Very good. They are the reporting agency.
I mean, I guess you're right. The federal government could say, well, we're not going to develop resources on federal land. But even there, you have private companies that have leases with the government. Right. I mean, those are contracts. You can't just, unless there's some provision in the contract, I guess, you can't just wave a wand and say, okay, this is just all just going to go away. So America's in a much different place. I guess the one thing we got going for us is that Russia and Saudi Arabia's economies are so dependent on oil and gas.
That's right.
That they can't. They have a limited capacity to do this to us because it's kind of like chemotherapy, right? I mean, they may think they're hurting us, but they're hurting themselves at the same time.
They're almost dying while they're hurting us. To be honest, to your point, remember they did try this just a few years ago, and the price of gasoline got real cheap, and the price of oil got real cheap, but we were able to outlast them for the very reason that you're citing. In the meantime, they've been storing up a lot themselves in terms of assets and revenue and whatnot to try to endure a longer shutdown. Russia can go. There's one analysis I saw where Russia could go like for 10 years at $20 oil. That's less than they need to run their government, but they've saved up enough that they could try to inflict that kind of pain. The problem is, here's the thing, Rob, we're probably not going to kill shale oil production in the United States with something like this, no matter how long it goes. But what we will do is kill shale producers and the value chain, the supply chain. And at the end of it all, there'll still be the oil under the ground. There'll still be the technology to do it. But instead of Continental Resources and many smaller companies that we know, Whiting, Oasis,
it's going to be the great big companies.
It's going to be right. It'll be
the literal big oil, right? I mean, that's
literal big oil. That's right.
I think
what that does is that squeezes the entire supply chain, as you know, in a big way.
How much do you think? Because you were talking about you wanted the U.S. to potentially withdraw troops from Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. As a way to say, listen, you guys get on board and stop doing this to us, or we're going to withdraw our troops. I mean, how much was that a factor in Saudi Arabia coming around on this?
Well, from what we're told by the State Department and others, a very, very big factor. I chose to take the big stick strategy to diplomacy because my sense of things early on was that the diplomacy was pretty light-handed. And I think largely because there's a big part of our economy that loves 99-cent gasoline. And that's what you're seeing in some parts of the country. The problem is 99-cent gasoline leads to $5 gasoline when the oligarchs are back in charge. Right. And the big companies aren't going to be helpful in that because they're so vertically integrated. They make money at every end of the value chain. So no, I took a big stick, and I have to give Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska a lot of credit. He and I have basically partnered on this. We're both on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We're both on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He has a very strong relationship with our ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He and I have gotten to know their ambassador to the United States quite well. In fact, we have a conversation on Saturday with Princess Rima. She's also a member of the royal family. She is their ambassador to the United States and their energy minister as well. So the two of us are going to be on the phone with them on Saturday. There's no question that threat is huge. And just as an example, as I told the princess last week when she called, they were under attack just it's probably been 2 weeks ago now, where several missile defense systems intercepted UAVs and or missiles coming from the Houthis, which is a subset of basically they're an Iranian surrogate. And they intercepted them and destroyed them before they were hit. Well, those are our missile defense systems operated by 2,500 American troops in Saudi Arabia. And they're largely protecting oil assets, and not to mention the Marines and the Navy that we have that escort their ships. So we're really facilitating their ability to both produce and export more of their oil while they declare a price war on ours. And so, and I might even just add this, and this will probably warm the hearts of a lot of your listeners. You might recall not that long ago, it was last year, but there was a resolution. It's called a privilege motion on the Senate floor to withdraw our troops from their support, Saudi support in the war in Yemen, the civil war in Yemen. That passed both the House and the Senate and went to the president, where he vetoed it to maintain a stronger diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia. And they're an important ally. I don't want to dismiss their strategic importance. We sustained his veto. Today, we would not. Today, I know at least 10 Republicans and maybe a couple more who supported the president's veto the first go-round and would not the next go-round. That's how important the legislation we had to withdraw from Saudi Arabia. It would pass. Let's put it that way. It would pass, and they know that.
Do you feel? And last question about this. It's essentially we've been with the oil issues and everything else going on, and Saudi Arabia and Russia. A lot of people have been saying this is the point I want to try to make. A lot of people, I've been hearing a lot of people saying, well, you bunch of Republicans are just socialists when it comes to big oil, right? And you just want to protect this industry, and your free market ideas go out the window. certainly, I mean, I think there's a lot of fair criticism. Republicans ideologically, there's a lot we could say about free markets and everything else going on. Now, the problem and my rebuttal to the people who are saying that is we are dealing with oil cartels. We're dealing with
right.
I mean, what you just said a little bit ago about Russia being able to essentially sort of game, like it's like, well, our government runs on oil, but we're going to build up reserves so that we can manipulate the market. That is not a free market. That is not a free market at all. And so we're stuck trying to preserve our American free market where we have small oil companies and big oil companies and everybody's competing to the greatest degree possible. And there's probably even some improvements that we could make on that front. But we're generally trying to protect what is generally a free market economy in a world where most of the oil competitors are not free market, like they're state owned. I mean, even some of our friends like Norway, right? They have a state owned oil company. I mean, and Norway is obviously a much more benign, and they're our friends and everything else. Not trying to besmirch the good people of Norway, but that's still a state owned oil company, and yet we don't have state owned oil company. I mean, this is really sort of the conundrum that we're faced with.
First of all, you're exactly right. Everything you said is right, including we are subject to some legitimate criticism, at least oversight of philosophy on these things. But globalization, of course, is complicated because there are always different forms of government and state-owned businesses and cartels and whatnot. But there are two industries, and maybe you've heard me say this before, but there are two industries that every sophisticated country with the kinds of resources we have are going to protect. One is food. We all are going to protect our own safe, secure food supply. And part of doing that, of course, is being able to export it because we're going to grow a lot more than we need. But we never want to be dependent on someone else for food. The other one is energy. And that's why you used to hear a lot about energy independence, and we still do. But energy independence is what leads to energy security. And so while we still, just as an example, we still import about 4 million barrels of oil per day into the United States. Yeah. While we produce about 12, we actually... 12 or 13 million, depending on the day or the time of the year, but we basically consume 17 million. Now, we also export about the same amount as we import. And so there is a big global market that can work when the rules are clearly understood and they're the same for everybody. And so we do want to be able to be independent because being independent is what allows us to be secure. And but it also raises the issue of the big refiners who like to use cheaper oil. They like to bring this heavy sour crude oil in from whether it's Canada or Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, Aramco is their big, of course, state-owned oil company. Well, Aramco owns the largest refinery on the west coast of the United States of America. So then we get into the whole issue of global ownership of our own, assets here in the country, much like the beef industry. 80% of the beef packing in this country is done by four companies. One of the companies is owned by Brazil. The other one's owned by China, and two of them are American-owned companies. So when you start, you start busting up the integrity or warping the integrity of food supply and energy supply, you do put your country in a economic and national security disadvantage.
Well, I think we free marketers have always, protectionism's a dirty word, right? We're not supposed to be protecting companies, but I feel like we should be protecting American companies from state-owned companies who don't have to operate, who aren't beholden to the same supply and demand and the creative destruction of the free market because they're state-sponsored. In the same way that government, like the U.S. federal government, clearly doesn't have to worry about running in the black. Neither do these others. I mean, they're sort of able to operate outside the bounds of the normal market. Anyway, let's talk more relief packages. I mean, let
me before we get to that, here's a nice bridge to that because I think you're onto something that's also we're going to have a very serious discussion about when this pandemic nonsense is over, and that is our vulnerability to other supply chains like pharmaceuticals, personal protection equipment, and ventilators, and all of those other things that the free market is where the free market's sort of letting us down because we've become dependent on state-owned industries in places like China, and we've exposed a vulnerability.
Well, let's talk about that. I wanted to talk about more relief legislation in Washington, D.C. next, but I also wanted to hit on trade because that's been a big issue during the Trump era. I mean, going back year 2018, election, your campaign against former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, a lot of that was on trade. And President Trump had kicked off a trade war with China. We were all worried about the impact of our economy. China's a big market for a lot of North Dakota goods. And I kind of started my attitudes about China, because I've always been very free trade, let the goods and services flow, all that stuff. And in a utopia, sure, that works. Unfortunately, we don't live in a utopia. And I've been rethinking, and I started to during the 2018 campaign, I've been rethinking a lot of our attitude about China. And I feel like it should change. I don't think trade and cheap goods or a lot of that stuff, that can't be the only lens that we look at a country like China through anymore. I feel like our attitude needs to change, and I feel like a lot of Americans are coming around on this too, at least just in the terms – there was just a Harris poll out today, and I realized in Washington, D.C., calling this the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus or whatever, there's been a lot of people upset about that. I'm a little frustrated with that, because it's like, we're – yeah. Anyway, that whole – I don't want to get into that debate. Outside of the Beltway, there is a bipartisan consensus that China is responsible for the virus, or at least the spread, or at least responsible for acting, being less than honest and less than forthcoming about the virus. I don't want to. I don't know if they perpetrated it on purpose or not. I don't think that they did, but certainly they've been irresponsible. 90%, according to this Harris poll, National Harris poll, 90% of Republicans said the Chinese government is responsible for the spread of the virus. 67% of Democrats. Right? I mean, that's a lot of Republicans and Democrats agreeing with one another. Also, neither party seems to know whether or not, there's a majority saying that they don't think China's going to fulfill its obligations under President Trump's Trade One deal. And part of me is thinking maybe this situation, it's time to break our trade, our previous approach to trade with China and try something new. Just completely new. Like maybe all the old stuff. I know it's going to hurt. We're already hurting from this. But I feel like all we've done in the past is fuel a monster in China.
Us and a whole bunch of other places in the world, because China is so big as a market that they have commanded a lot. But remember, we gave them favored nation status, let them into the World Trade Organization, and that, by the way, is stuff that was done. It's been done under both Republican and Democratic presidents.
Clinton was a big leader on it. The Bushes were,
The Bushes definitely were, absolutely. You can go all the way back to Richard Nixon's trip to China if you want to really read about the history of our relationship in the sort of the modern era. And it gets back to sort of the earlier discussion. When you play by a different set of rules than the people you're doing business with, we've always hoped, right, that democracy and capitalism would flourish in other places.
We were hoping that it would undermine the CCP, right? We were hoping that it would undermine communism, and it hasn't. The communists have just sort of adopted this quasi-capitalist system to fuel their authoritarian communist regime.
Precisely right. So we have this conundrum, as you said. Maybe more capitalist, freedom-loving countries need to band together and pledge to do business with each other more, because whenever you do a sanction of some sort or an embargo of some sort, it only works if everybody else participates. Now, the one thing we do have, and this is something that Donald Trump has understood for 30 years or so, if you read everything he's ever said, and that is, we are the biggest market. We are 25% of the global economy in the United States. So we're the big consumers. Nobody likes to be left out of a deal with the United States. And that's why he's pretty effectively, flexed his muscles in lots of deals, whether it's Iran nuclear deal or, trade with China and whatnot. But you can become too dependent. And we're probably in that situation. It's a good time to reconsider all of these things. But also remember, on the national defense front, these same countries do things that they advance things that we don't advance because we try to remain, within certain constructs. And that is, for example, Russia and China, they really basically don't pay their military. So when they have a military spending at a certain level, they're pouring it all into new technologies, and we're doing cost of living adjustments and providing benefits to our military men and women because they're our most valuable part of the warfighting machine. Getting back to playing by on a level playing field, we like cheap stuff to the point you mentioned earlier, whether it's in the supply chain of big things or whether it's just in buying little things at the retail level. China produces a lot of that stuff, but they also aren't generous to the people. They don't play by the same standards of environmental protection, of workforce protection, of workforce compensation. And it's a big, complicated world out there. And it's, to your point, I'm sorry to chuckle, but when you say you've been rethinking those things since 2018 election, there are a whole bunch of Republicans rethinking, right? I think you asked me a couple of weeks ago, are you a populist? I mean, I think there's a part of us, of all of us, that has sort of reconsidered our original dogma, our earlier dogma.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I'm still very much a free market person, but for the same reason, I mean, free markets are vulnerable to states, right? To state entities. Yeah. So for the same reason that if I'm trying to start a business and the government is providing that same business, it's hard to compete with the government because the government can lose money. The government also is the referee and makes the rules, right? So it's a tough thing. Yep. And so I think free markets are great, but they do need to be protected. And it's not the sort of protectionism where we're going to pick one free market company over another. It's that we need to protect them from state actors on the global stage. We just do. We need to protect our free markets from the Chinas of the world, and frankly, the Saudi Arabias and the Russias and all the rest of them.
You know what's interesting though? The one thing that can have a greater impact at a higher level, of course, is, and I think China's got this potential, and Iran is another country that has this potential. And that is a well-informed population. But one of the hallmarks of totalitarianism and communism is misinformation and censorship and those kinds of things. And whenever we start having some breakthroughs, whether it's with freedom-loving students in Iran or protesters in China, the government comes down pretty hard. At some point, though, as I always say, even an emperor for life can't ignore 1.5 billion angry constituents. And but again, how much do we want to participate in those kinds of things in other parts of the world when we have plenty of our own problems?
Well, that's a philosophical discussion that's going to be going on for a while.
Sure
but I think a lot of people are shifting on it, and I think that's probably a good thing. Let's talk about the potential for more aid relief legislation. I mean, part of it's just, I mean, we're still trying to implement what we already passed.
Right.
I know the unemployment benefits are just beginning to become available. I've been talking to a lot of people locally who are trying to work with the SBA. That process has been a little uneven.
A little
uneven,
yeah.
I think it's fair to say, although to be expected given the timeline we're doing all this stuff on. So I'm not trying to cast blame, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Nope.
We're all trying.
But it's a fair statement.
We're all trying. What about, I mean, is there more that can be done? And also, I mean, you're quarantined in Bismarck right now. What's the capability of Congress to come to office, to come together and vote on this stuff right now when we're still living under social distancing?
Well, if we start with the last one, we'll go all day because you and I love the discussion of dispersing government, and I wish we could do more. Yesterday I participated in, I think, 4 different meetings / conference calls, either with the Vice President and the Coronavirus Task Force, or in one case, the Environment and Public Works Committee, in another case, the Banking Committee, and then talking to Stephen Mnuchin and his team with the Banking Committee. So can we do this? Can we do some stuff? Sure, except what we don't do very well is vote. And that was illustrated yesterday when the one program that has rolled out and is now a week old, and that is the Paycheck Protection Program, the SBA program that has, as you said, been distributed somewhat unevenly, although it is getting out the door and it is wildly popular. And as of noon yesterday, $120 billion had been lent to small businesses to pay employees and to keep them on the payroll. So it's wildly popular, but we only funded it to the tune of $350 billion, and we're really just not
just popular. I mean, the government giving money away is always popular, not that they're giving money away. I don't. And again, I'm not trying to be pejorative, but But I think the point I'm trying to make is it's also the most effective. Because there's so many things downstream. If you could stay in your job and keep your health insurance and keep your paycheck coming in, and also be in a position where when some of this lifts, you can just go back to work. That is going to lighten the load on a lot of our other social net, because that means you're not going to have to file for unemployment. You're maybe going to avoid, maybe if things TANF or SNAP food stamps or a lot of the other programs we have out there. If we could just avoid all that by just keeping people in their jobs, boy, that's a win. And I really feel like you're saying, we should have been funding it more.
So here's the problem. So we knew it would be popular. In fact, a week ago today, when I was sitting with the president in the White House, he looked right at me and he said, "Kevin," and by the way, that was about 4 in the afternoon. So the Paycheck Protection Program started that morning, like at 12:01 a.m. And it was, I think they rolled out like $4 billion that first day and hitting the glitches. The first day hurdles, and they were working through all that. And he said, "This is going to be really popular, and I'm afraid it's not going to be enough. Do you think we can fund it with some more money? It should be easy, right?" And one of the things I love about Donald Trump is his naivete about politics is still sort of there, right? I mean, he still sort of thinks easy things should always be easy. And I said, first of all, it's going to be the most popular part of the program for all the reasons you just stated, Rob, because it makes the most sense to people. It's aimed at the right place. And you have a distribution system through banks and credit unions and other financial institutions that already exist. So I said, it's going to be very popular. It's the first chapter of an 880-page bill. But I said, he said, well, then everybody must be for it. I said, it was popular right out of the chute. Always had bipartisan support. It was never controversial politically. However, I said, never underestimate the ability for low-hanging fruit to become somebody's leverage for other things they want. While it might be unanimously supported in Congress, as soon as you try to put more money into it, there will be people that come and say, "I'm not supporting that unless I get these other 3 or 4 things that I want." Now, that's important because yesterday Democrats came to the floor and opposed a unanimous consent motion by Mitch McConnell to add $250 billion just to the Paycheck Protection Program. Nothing else, not any more money for states, not any more money for hospitals. Not that those things won't be coming eventually, but those things haven't gone out the door yet. We don't know how popular they're going to be. And so we missed the opportunity yesterday to pass it. Now we're going to probably have to go start negotiating on other things that Nancy Pelosi might want if we're going to ever get this thing passed. So it's never as easy as it ought to be.
Well, just in terms of what might be coming next, I mean, we have the checks that are going to start showing up at people's accounts. We have the unemployment the expanded unemployment benefits, which should start being available. We have the SBA loans coming through. If Congress were to do another thing, what would that thing be in your mind?
Yeah. So first of all, I hope we take our time doing another thing, because the biggest chunk of the money that's to shore up mid-size and larger businesses, part of that just got rolled out yesterday, and it's yet to be seen how the Federal Reserve will work with the banking and financial institutions to backstop some of these programs. And these would all be loans and maybe in a few cases equity positions, although I hate the idea of the federal government taking equity positions, especially if they end up taking board positions. But we'll worry about that if we get there. I hope we take our time and see how it rolls out. And if we need to shore up certain things like the Paycheck Protection Program, because it's being used and utilized the way we want it to, that we could just simply fund it. As we talk about a phase 4 too, I would hope most of it would be focused on the combating the virus itself. We're asking our hospitals to leave a lot of capacity open, which means they're not doing business, especially the kind of business that they do that provides them an actual profit. So we need to shore up that and the testing and all those things. And if we need to, we need to, and we ought to do it. But we don't need, in my view, we don't need to go really big again, because the goal should be to get people back to work and the economy going again. I worry that if you provide too many incentives for that to not happen, it's less likely that it will happen. And the best thing we do is get things back in order. Now, I also talk a lot about, in one of our meetings yesterday with the Environment and Public Works Committee was on this, and the president talks a lot about a stimulus in the form of an infrastructure bill. Well, we've passed an infrastructure bill in the Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously, and it's like $750 billion. The president wants to borrow $2 trillion and go really, really big on an infrastructure thing. And there are some people, including some conservatives, who think that might not be a bad idea since you can borrow money for free now. But that doesn't mean you have to pay it back. I told Squawk Box the other morning when we were talking about this, I said, Donald Trump as a businessman sees debt as leverage. But in politics and governing, debt is debt. And if you can leverage it, great. But, we already have $22, $23 trillion of debt. And we need to be really careful about how we approach these things.
Last question. I know there's been a lot of talk, and it's something I keep getting asked by people who are looking at some of these SBA loans and getting, I think there's like an initial $10,000 they could get. There's the word forgivable being thrown around a lot, but I don't think anybody really knows what that means. What does that look like? How likely are those things to be forgiven?
Yeah, they're pretty likely. On the small business side of it, with the Paycheck Protection Program, it's designed, as we've been saying, to keep employees connected to their employer. So on the one hand, you have unemployment, and if you have to lay people off or you have laid people off and they go home and they collect unemployment, we've shored that up, and it's going to be sort of state by state how the rules roll out on that, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. But that said, the Paycheck Protection Program is designed to keep employees employed. And if you do that, there are certain parameters, but if you keep people employed and you're still paying them what they were getting paid before, and including their benefits and whatnot, that part is intended to be forgiven. So, like I said, there's a formula for all of that, but it's pretty basic in that if you're keeping people employed, paying their salary and their benefits, and you demonstrate that at the end, that is intended to be forgiven. So it's really a grant disguised as a loan.
You've been so generous with your time, and I just, because
pleasure.
North Dakotans have a ton of people here are self-employed, construction workers and whatnot. Maybe you've got your own construction company, you build people garage. I don't know. But they're wondering, I don't really have any employees. It's just me. Are they in the same position? I mean, are they going to be treated differently? Are they a different category?
Oh, I love that question, because the answer is they are going to be treated the same. And that part of the program kicked in yesterday. I believe the guidance might have gone out even late Wednesday, and they kicked it out yesterday. So if you're self-employed, sole proprietor, 1099, you can apply for through your bank, through your lender, or even like what's it called, FinTax. There's even online banks where you can apply for the loan, and as long as you can demonstrate, and the first thing you do is you attest in a 2-page application, you can go back to February 15th, that this is what you were being paid, a certain amount that you were earning in the previous year, and you can pay yourself that amount. You can get the loan, pay yourself that amount, and then at the end of it, again, demonstrate with very minimal documentation, really, that this is what you used the money for, was to pay yourself. And maybe you and your spouse, or you and one kid, or you and one hired hand, or whatever the case might be, and it will be forgiven. So we were very clear on that when we did the legislation. It took a little longer for that part of it to roll out, because SBA didn't already have a program for that, but they did for this 7A program was designed for small businesses, and it was easy for us to utilize that vehicle. But rules did have to be drafted specifically to the self-employed, and that is out there now. And by the way, the same applies to unemployment insurance. We want to make sure that unemployment insurance was more broadly available as well, the benefits of unemployment insurance. But that's runs through the state job service, and so everybody will have probably a little different take on that.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time.
Rob, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Stay safe.